Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Welcome everybody back to the next TEXNH lecture we have here at NIA, at the Netherlands Institute, which of course, as you know, is a collaboration between a variety of institutes, museums and universities. We had a break in February because I wasn't here, but I'm very happy to be back here. I came yesterday to start a new series, and we have the next talk in our sub-theme of cross-craft interaction by Dr. Carlotta Gardner. So what I would like to do is introduce her first, and then also our discussant, because all the TEXNH talks have a discussant later on. And so, but before I do that, I would also like to stimulate you or interest you for our next TEXNH talk, which is on the 24th of April, by Professor Fitch from Vienna University, and he will talk about the cross-craft interaction through the aspect of iconography. He will talk about wall paintings, pottery, and a variety of aspects in prehistory. So you're all welcome to that as well, of course. Also, thanks for joining us online. I know there's a nice crowd out there as well, so welcome to everybody. So we have Dr. Carlotta Gardner, and she earned her BSc in Bradford University, after which she obtained an MSc in UCL at the Institute of Archaeology, and also conducted her AHRC-funded PhD there on metalworking crucibles in Roman Britain. In between, she also worked as a curatorial assistant and researcher in the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford. In 2018, but Carlotta was already at the British School at that point, she just told me, she became the Williams Fellow in Ceramic Petrology at the British School until 2023, when she became the Fitch Research and Outreach Officer, a position that she still has today. Her main interests include clay-based and pyrotechnological materials, for example, the archaic and classical pottery production from Corinth and Sicyon that she studied, but also functional ceramics such as metal crucibles and a variety of such clay-based objects and materials. She has also worked on the technologies of glass and waste materials, and hence her focus on intercraft aspects, which is one of the main reasons she's here with us today. Carlotta's current research aims is to investigate ancient pottery production in the northern Peloponnese, addressing questions of raw material exploitation, organization of production, and cross-craft interaction. Her research employs a range of analytical techniques, including experimental data, and we'll hear about that today as well, to explore questions about the technology and provenance of ceramics, but not just ceramics. And then our discussant, Dr. Anno Heim. Dr. Anno Heim is senior researcher at the Institute of Nanoscience and Nanotechnology at Demokritos, and he studied physics and informatics at the University of Bonn, where he also obtained his PhD in '96 at ELSA, and ELSA stands for the Bonn Electron Stretcher Accelerator, on total reflection XRF with synchrotron radiation. In '98, he came to Demokritos as a postdoctoral researcher, where he focused on the integrated study of archaeological ceramics. Between 2002 and 2006, he was associate researcher at Demokritos, and afterwards worked on a variety of different projects concerning the characterization and conservation of archaeological materials in Greece. And then in 2010, he took up a permanent position at Demokritos, where he was next promoted as senior researcher in 2014. His research interests in the field of cultural heritage concern the investigation of archaeological materials, especially the raw material management, the manufacturing processes, and dissemination and technology transfer. And here I can easily see that the two of you will be a very good match today. He has a particular interest in studies on the design and thermomechanical performance of functional ceramics and built structures such as ovens, for example. And I remember our small collaboration in Athens in that sense. He's also taught in master courses at 2 Greek universities, ongoing as far as I know, and he's given plenty of guest lectures at several European universities. But first, Carlotta, I'm looking forward to hearing you, and a warm welcome by everybody.
Okay, well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me. Today I'll be talking about my slightly vague title, Cross-craft Interaction Under the Microscope. My abstract was quite ambitious, so I apologise that I have restricted slightly what I will be talking about today. I'm focusing on crucibles from the Bronze Age through to the post-medieval period, and touching on a little bit of today's practice as well. and really to begin to understand the interactions that we can potentially see across these periods. So to begin with, I don't think I really need to introduce this to anybody, but cross-craft interaction, as Anne and I were just talking about, has been successfully applied for some time now, and we're seeing a much larger kind of uptake of this as a practice across a wide variety of archaeological contexts, but also in different kind of disciplines within archaeology itself. And in the scientific study of archaeological materials, we're more recently beginning to see this kind of application, and it's producing some really, really interesting results. This publication was one of, I guess, one of the first major kind of publications that looked at this, and it was on cross-craft and cross-cultural interactions in ceramics. I advise anybody to go and have a look at it. To begin with, I thought I'd have a look very quickly at two case studies that have been published in the literature which use archaeological science and cross-craft interaction to investigate materials and to really begin to explore the extra layer that the scientific analysis of materials can provide for us. This was a paper by James Peake and Ian Freestone in 2012 that looked at cross-craft interactions between the metal and glassworking industries through the look at slag additions to early Anglo-Saxon red glass. And this is a really, I again really recommend this paper as well. It's a really interesting study of a quite unique material, these opaque red glass beads that are found across the south of Britain. And they looked at one site and were able to investigate these materials in quite some detail using scanning electron microscopy. And what they were really looking at was to try and establish this connection between the glass and the glass technologies and metal production industries that so many people have speculated about in the past. And up until then, very little evidence had actually been provided of a material basis. It was all just kind of talk about, these similarities. And one of the things that they were able to one of the things that they questioned was the very limited evidence, of which one of them is that they were using kind of hammer scale or copper alloy scale in colouring pale or blue turquoise glass. But James and Ian suggest this is quite a tentative connection. However, through the work that they did with this opaque red glass, they were able to identify a very direct connection between the metals and the glass industry. And they were able to suggest that these interactions actually led to innovations in the production of this material. And this is kind of summarised by this quote here, where we see that they basically are suggesting that innovations in practice happening because of these interactions. So that's one example. The next example is a very, very, very recent paper by Carlotta Gardner, which came out about no more than a month ago, and her colleagues, which really looked, in this case, actually at clay-based materials. And this is a really interesting study that takes into account a whole range of different materials and tries to understand how the preparation of the materials and the procurement of materials suggests some interaction between different craftspeople. And what they were able to do through ceramic thin-section petrography was to analyse a whole range of materials, as I said, including wall plaster, mud bricks, loom weights, tableware, cookingware, crucibles, etc., etc. And they were able to reveal similarities in the procurement and the processing of specific raw materials for very specific products. And they used this as evidence to suggest three communities of practice that were across different craft domains and producing different materials, different products with the same materials. So one of the interesting ones, obviously because I'm interested in crucibles, is that the crucibles and the cookingware were the same fabric. And so they were, this wasn't a particularly local material, they were going away from the site to collect the material and processing it on site to produce these objects. Whereas others, like tableware and things, were being produced from a much more local clay, and these were also found similarities elsewhere. And here, I think, again, summing up this paper, I think what's really important to take away from this is that they were able to highlight a really dense network of interactions between different industries. And I think this is, again, something that Anne and I were just talking about, that you can't really look at one craft by itself. There are so many interactions and networks that are happening in order for that craft to perform, that craft person to perform, but also for these objects to be produced. And ceramics are a really beautiful material to investigate this with. And this was kind of, again, summarised by Maxon in the publication that in the first book that I showed you, the volume. And he described ceramics as the hub of ancient craft interplay. And I really quite strongly agree with this. I think here are some objects on the screen. I think all of these provide evidence of cross-craft interaction from the word go. We're seeing products being made for different industries and serving purposes and trying to fulfill a need. So we have, for example, ceramic amphora, which were produced to contain the product of another craft or another industry, such as oil or fish sauce production or wine. And of course, these technical requirements were interlinked and really important. We have loom weights, which were used in textiles production, and these again needed very specific requirements of weight and size. And we can even stretch it to cooking pots, roof tiles, and things like this, I'd argue. And of course, beehives, this odd object at the top, if you didn't know, but also pigment bowls used for pigments. The list is endless. But today, I think because I love them, one of the best examples is the investigation of metalworking crucibles, or crucibles actually more generally, and this will be the focus of the talk today. So crucibles, as I'm sure many of you know, are defined as a vessel that contains a reaction, and in archaeological periods, at least pre-medieval contexts, they're used for metalworking, a variety of different metalworking processes, and also for glass melting. They're most often used at very high temperatures, at least for this period, so we're talking over 1,000 degrees, and they are very typically made from ceramic. Overall, there's a very kind of general lack of analysis of them. What we find is, as is the case with all of these objects, they kind of tend to fall between specialisms, and so we see a lack of analysis of them. What tends to happen is a crucible is found and it's given to an archaeometallurgist, and this is then they're analysed to identify what they were used for, what process they were involved in. And this is, I'm not saying that this is a valuable information, it's very valuable information and we should continue doing this. But what we're missing is the fact that they're actually ceramic objects, and we're missing this connection, this potential connection. And something that I started questioning during my master's and then have continued on, as you will see, is the question of who was making them. So who was making these crucibles for the metalworkers? A little disclaimer here. A lot of the material that I will show today is British material, but I think that the key points and the take-homes from this are applicable to material from across, well, everywhere, to be honest, but also here in Greece, in Greek archaeology. So although it's predominantly British material, because that's what I'm most familiar with, I think a lot of these ideas could be applied here in Greece as well. So in pre-Roman Britain, at least, metal melting crucibles were very, very simple handmade forms. They were often very coarse fabrics, and they often were quite porous and not particularly very refractory. And refractory means that they were not that they're able to withstand high temperatures. So in these situations, they weren't actually often very refractory. And this is because they didn't need to be necessarily. The way that these crucibles were used was slightly different to later periods. You'll see here, can you see the maps? Yeah. We have these very small hemispherical, these are late Iron Age examples. This is a form that we find across Britain, this triangular form with three pouring spouts. And what we find is that they sit in charcoal and the heat is directed over the top of them. So they're not needing to be very conductive or anything like that. So what we find is that these outer edges are highly, they're like melted, they're vitrified, whereas this lower part is often almost unfired. It's very, very low fired ceramics. So they didn't need to be quite as refractory as their later counterparts. But even so, the materials that they used were really important, and we see, for a variety of reasons that Anna has also looked into, we see the use of, for example, very quartz-rich ceramics with lots of temper, but also these examples here where we have charcoal, which basically creates a reducing environment, which is ideal for melting metal, but also keeping it very porous and insulating. Now, very, very little work has been done on these in terms of the ceramics, and actually one of the only studies in the UK, at least, is by a PhD thesis, which was finished in 1983, so a very, very long time ago, by Howard, and it's an excellent PhD, where she looked at a whole range of material from across Britain and tried to investigate the materials through petrography and tried to understand what was happening. And what she discovered is that there was very, very careful preparation of the local raw materials. And she suggested that there was a real specialist knowledge here on what was ideal for the use. However, she was saying that they were very much likely produced by metal workers and not by a local potter. However, I think what would be really important, and I think needs further work, is to expand these studies and to compare them with the local ceramic repertoire and to really begin to understand what was actually happening on a broader scale and to really look at it across the crafts as well, to really begin to actually understand what was happening and any potential cross-craft interactions. Now, moving into the Roman period, and to give you a little context here, I think everybody knows that the Roman period was, there was technological revolutions happening all over the place. It was a really important period. But in Britain, in terms of pottery production, it was also really, really important. Here is when we start to see the introduction of the potter's wheel. So we're much, much later than Greece. And this is where we see in the very late Iron Age communities a slight adoption of a possible use of a wheel, but it's not really until the conquest by the Romans of Britain that we see the introduction of the wheel and the spread of its use. And this is also where we start to see mass production happening, and we see pottery production on a whole new scale. We also see the introduction of kilns. So in the earlier periods, we are still seeing pit firings, whereas the Romans bring kind of solid standard kilns to the British Isles. So this is obviously a huge, important moment in our history. And with this, what we see is the introduction of wheel-thrown vessels used as crucibles in metal and glass working. But something that I questioned in my PhD, and was the main focus of this, is were these specifically vessels made for metal and glass workers? And this is something that we'll explore a little bit now in detail. I should say, and here this is why I think it's relevant across the board, that this use of wheel-thrown vessels in the Roman period is a widespread technological tradition. So this map shows examples that I found in the literature or that I've seen in person. And this is actually of two-layered crucibles, particularly. So you can see here in this example, you have a second layer of clay applied to the wheel-thrown vessel. But ultimately, these are wheel-thrown vessels with a second layer. But you can see this huge spread. And that's, I think, really quite important as a consideration. But the case studies that we'll look at today in detail are London, Oxfordshire, Hadrian's Wall. These are all three are related to metalworking. And then we'll move to York, where we'll have a quick look at glass melting crucibles as well. So in London, which was one of the main case studies of my PhD, I looked at around 500 crucibles. And a total of 85% of these were identified as wheel-thrown vessels, and very specifically, they were verulamium whiteware crucibles. And the majority of them were these jar beaker forms that you see here, and this was really quite remarkable as a finding. Some of them were also these very small kind of repurposed lamps, which is also interesting, but they were used for precious metals mostly. But this is the real kind of, the really impressive idea that so many metal workers were using the same crucible form. And why was there so much prevalence? Well, verulamium, which is now modern-day St Albans, was a really major supplier to London of all types of pottery. So these are the two kiln sites, and we see a huge you can see how all of the finds are basically centred in and around London. So it's not really surprising that these were the people that were producing crucibles, if anybody was at all. The material itself, the fact that the ceramic itself is also incredibly refractory, so it's able to withstand quite high temperatures. And so verulamium is a white firing fabric, which is rich in quartz inclusions, and it has very low fluxing elements, which is hit down in this corner of a ternary diagram. So the ideal crucibles today would probably fall somewhere down here, but in archaeological context, this is a really quite impressive range that we're seeing here. So again, it's an ideal material for use as a crucible. But I also think that there's an aspect of this, a much more social aspect of this, which is potentially looking at communities of practice. So this is the spread of the crucibles that we see across London. So it's not isolated to a particular area, it's across the entire board. And we're seeing this spread of the use of a very specific form across London. And how this happened, I'm not entirely sure. Was it word of mouth, or was it some form of standardization of practice? It's unclear. We know that there were collegia or craft guilds in this period, and we know that there was some kind of standardization of practice through management of large workshop zones. So this is also another potential aspect that was introducing this widespread use of these crucibles. But were they repurposed or specially produced? And this is where it becomes really important for considering cross-craft interaction. Similar vessels to these have been found in domestic settings, but they were much larger than the crucibles that we find. So the smaller examples that we see used as crucibles have not been found in a domestic context. And this was, I should say, up until 2018 when I submitted my thesis. I don't know if they found any since, but up until then, they were not found in these settings. However, they aren't the ideal shape for a crucible. Whilst they are the ideal fabric, they are not the ideal shape. So we're still in a period where we're having crucibles sitting in charcoal. We're not sitting on a furnace floor or anything like that. There need to be rounded bottoms. And as you can see, this base is very much a flat form. And what we see is that this extra layer, which through work at Democritos and also at Fitch, we were able to prove is superior in many ways for helping to protect the crucible itself. But I'd also argue that it's there simply as a way of adapting the vessel form to make it suitable for use. And in this situation, we see them rounding the bases so that they sit steadily in the charcoal. But we also, in some cases, see the adaptation by adding a lip, for example, or a pouring spout. So they're really using these as a way of customizing their tools. Whatever the case, their production was very much embedded within a pottery producing industry. There was some suggestion in the 80s that there was maybe a specialist crucible production industry in the UK, but I would argue that this is not the case. They're very much embedded within a pottery producing industry, as I just said. However, I'd still argue that interactions are very much evident, and we're seeing potential cross-craft interaction, but also interaction between the same craft and industry. So the spread of these crucibles is an indication of interaction. And I'd also suggest that there is a dependency on the potting industry here. We're seeing metal workers, 85% of the choices that they're making are wheel-thrown vessels from ferrolenium. And so I'd suggest there is the beginning at least, of a dependency on the potting industry for their tools. Moving to Oxfordshire, we see a slightly different situation. Here we're seeing rounded, pointed bottoms on these vessels here. And the excavators who excavated a number of kiln sites here found these vessels and suggested actually that they were crucible types. And later we have found examples across the south of Britain, for example here in Silchester and Alcester and also at Gestingthorpe Villa. So we know that they're being used as crucibles. And what I'd argue here is that they are I'd confidently suggest that they are specialist forms. They are made for metalworkers for use as crucibles. Their spread, I don't believe, is evidence of a takeover in industry or a huge trade of these crucibles across the south of Britain. I'd suggest that they're actually itinerant metalworkers because we often only find them in individual cases. So we're having a metalworker taking their crucible and moving around until it breaks. And here I think we can argue for a slightly stronger case of cross-craft interaction, where we're seeing a very specific form being made for the metalworker. So there's there's potentially some interaction there where, let's say, a metalworker and a potter are coming together and they're having a conversation about what makes the ideal crucible. Now, we also see this across the continent. It's not just in Britain. We see examples, here you can see two published examples of rounded based crucibles that have also been adapted with an extra layer, which is interesting as a kind of argument. But also this one here in Cologne, I'm not entirely sure, maybe Anna would have more of an opinion on this one, but I think these are all potentially specialist crucibles being produced for metalworkers. Now, in complete contrast on Hadrian's Wall, we're seeing huge diversity. and we're seeing almost all of them are handmade. You can see just some of the forms that we're seeing across the wall along here. So Hadrian's Wall is obviously the most northern part of the empire, it's the edge of the empire, but there is no lack of contact, there's no lack of resources. So we're seeing a choice here to use handmade vessels as crucibles. Here on Hadrian's Wall, I was able to look at around 115 crucibles from 3 or 4 sites, and 88% of these were handmade forms. And they, as I said and you've seen, they fit into a wide variety of different forms and very loosely fit into 7 different types that are predefined by Justine Bailey. There are examples of wheel-thrown forms, and there are very few of them, of course, but the ones that do exist are very much repurposed vessels. These here are from Vindolanda, and you can see, I hope you can see, that there is decoration on this shirt, and we have a very simple decoration up here. And these we know are Nene Valley ware vessels. So the Nene Valley Roman pottery production centre was near Peterborough, near Cambridge. And it supplied the Roman wall. It supplied the military forts with these vessels that were used for drinking and various other kind of domestic kind of experiences. They were not designed for use as crucibles. They're incredibly thin. They're millimeters thick in their kind of wall thickness. And you can see that they've been adapted for use by adding a second layer. You can see here a very, very thick outer layer being applied. And here I think it would be a push to say that there's any interaction. However, results of analysis of the handmade forms do suggest, much in the same way that Pamela has actually used her study of materials, there is potentially some similarity in the use of local resources. So I was very lucky to be able to study some Corbridge mortaria, which were produced at the fort at Corbridge, which is on the wall. And here we see that there's the potential mixing of 2 different materials. So in this region of Hadrian's Wall, we see a very kind of, the clay is readily available, it's red firing, it's not particularly refractory, it's pretty kind of just a standard average clay, it's not very exciting. But there's also available, the Romans were exploiting coal seams in this region. Above the coal seams is this material called seat earth, which is a really, really refractory clay, sorry. And we see the use of this still today for refractory ceramics. But what we see is that what seems to be the case at least, is that the potters were using these 2 materials for their mortaria. So they were crushing the seat earth and adding it to their local clay. And what we found was exactly the same thing in the crucibles. So we saw that there was a higher proportion of the seat earth, which is not surprising considering they needed it to be refractory. But we're seeing the shared resources and shared ideas kind of continuing. And so therefore, I think again, you could suggest there is some interaction here, even though they're handmade, with the potting industry and the metal workers. Now moving on to York and the glass melting crucibles that were found, these are quite a rare find in the Roman period. In the Roman period, glass melting happened in tanks, so crucibles are not very common finds. But the examples that we do find in the UK are wheel-thrown. So we're seeing shared practice here between the metals and the glass industry. They're both choosing to use wheel-thrown crucibles for their practice. And this is work by Hilary Cool and her colleagues, and they looked at a glass production site, and they were able to identify that the crucibles that they were using were from the very local pottery. So they were evilware, as it's called, and you can see that it's like less than a couple of 100 meters between them, and it did not fit any of the repertoire of the pottery at all. And so they use this to suggest that these are also specialist forms, produced for glass workers. We also have examples from 2 other sites in the UK, and again, this just to emphasise that this is not obviously common practice to use crucibles, but when they are, they're using wheel-thrown forms. So I'd argue that Roman crucibles are a material expression of cross-craft interaction. We're seeing here a potential dependency on the ceramics industry, whether the crucibles were specially produced or not. In Britain, the introduction of the wheel led to an exploration of new possibilities, but ultimately, this was a cultural package coming from the continent. It wasn't necessarily an innovation, let's say. It was something that was the kind of the thing to do, and this cultural package came in with the Romans. But what we're seeing is definitely a transfer of knowledge, ideas, and techniques. And how this knowledge was transferred empire-wide, I'm still very unclear about, and I'd be very happy to hear your suggestions. But ultimately, interactions existed with each other, so between crafts, between individual crafts, so between metalworkers, for example, but also between crafts, and also very much within their environment. Now, before concluding and wrapping up, I wanted to push this a little bit further and take this actually to the modern day, and to begin to look at crucible production after the Roman period. And this is very much new work, and I'd be very interested to hear your opinions on this, because I'd like to test a few ideas out on you. So, after the Roman period in Britain, we see kind of a slight decline, let's say, in the use of these technologies. Very much handmade forms persist in this kind of in-between period, but there is also the use of wheel-thrown vessels as crucibles. And this is when we start to potentially see, again, specialist production of crucibles. So this is a continuation of a technology, but there is a definite dip in this. Now, these two crucibles are made from Stamford ware, and again, it's a very refractory white firing clay. And these are spread across the country. So we're seeing the trade of these objects. These are spread all over the country. So we're beginning to see a specialist producer, again, as part of a potting repertoire. It's not just that they're producing crucibles, but we're beginning to see the spread of these materials across wider distances. Then moving later again to the post-medieval period, this is where we really begin to see specialist crucible producers becoming evident. And this case study is, I'd like to thank Justine Bailey for bringing it to my attention. I had kind of missed this one. This is material from the Tower of London, where there was a mint. And these are grog-tempered crucibles. They come in a variety of different forms, as you can see here, but there are more as well. And this was published as an English Heritage Research report by Harriet White and Teresa Cairns in 2010. And I know that further work has been happening with this. But these crucibles were grog-tempered, and the grog themselves was actually crucibles. So we're seeing this reuse within this industry. But there's also this small excerpt here, which is almost an obituary, in a way, to a pot maker for the mint in the Tower of London. So this is a pot maker working at the mint, and presumably making crucibles. I can't imagine what else they'd be making at this point. But this is immediately evidence of a specialist crucible producer, I'd argue. And they argue too, I should say, it's not mine. And then taking it one step further, in the later post-medieval period, and this is work by Marcos Martín Torres, we begin to see mass specialist production happening. And this is the centres in the Hessian crucibles and the Bavarian graphite crucibles. And these are hugely superior. They are wonderful materials. They're still famous today. We still use graphite crucibles today. Hessian crucibles, I think they still use the term Hessian to describe a triangular shaped crucible. So they're really well regarded, and they were then too. And these became a traded commodity. You see the distribution across Europe. I think there's actually examples of the graphite crucibles at Corinth as well. But you can see that they even travel to the Americas, and there's evidence of them in India and China as well. And here I think what we're beginning to see is horizontal specialization, where we're seeing the separation of an industry into a new one. So we're not seeing a stacking of industry, we're seeing the spread of it. So we're seeing a crucible production industry beginning and supplying the metals. But I also argue that actually this might lead to less interaction. And so we're seeing a decline in the amount of interaction that's happening with this huge mass production. I think you could still argue very much that there was at some point an interaction between metalworkers saying this would be my dream crucible, but then it kind of stops, and this is very much a standardized form that's produced for many, many, many years and is still today. And then moving lastly to today, where we obviously still use crucibles in many industries, but also still in the metal industry. We see these are the graphite crucibles here that are still in use today. I don't know where they're produced, but we also see these types of crucibles being made, which are basically almost pure quartz. And then of course we have a whole variety of different crucibles as well. But in conversation with a jeweler that I've been talking to, Sophie Boons, she was telling me about how she needs to adapt her crucible. So despite the fact that they are now on a mass-produced basis, and we can click online and order a crucible at the drop of a hat, they still very much are not actually exactly what the metalworker wants. And here she pointed me to a forum on how to prepare your crucible. And so they describe it as dressing the crucible, and it was very much an apprentice's job. And some of the crucibles didn't have a very good pouring spout, so one would have to grind a slightly deeper groove in one side. So we're seeing the adaptation of these crucibles that are being produced. And once the shape and depth of the spout was correct, one warmed up the new crucible, applying the heat evenly all over to its top, sides and underneath until it was hot enough to make sprinkled borax melt and stick to its surface. And this is a really standard practice. When you look at this forum, they're all, I mean, it's everybody does. There are videos on YouTube on how to do it. And what's interesting is that they're basically applying this layer as a flux. So it's taking out all the impurities of any of the metal and keeping the gold or silver that they're melting very, very clean. But here, and Sophie admits herself, she actually doesn't really know what her crucibles are made from. So we've gone really from the Bronze Age, where they were making their own crucibles potentially and knowing everything about the material they were using, to the point where it's just a crucible that you buy online and you don't really know very much about it, but you still have to adapt it. And I think that is really the extreme case of this. We see this kind of, as I say, ebbs and flows in cross-craft interaction. And I think by moving from this close interaction through to a less horizontal kind of specialization, we see it with industrialization. I think it's a really interesting kind of concept to think about. It's only really possible when you look at these large time spans. I think it's really important to consider reuse versus specialist production when we're looking at these, and that tools really are very, very personal. You see this all over everywhere these days. Now the craft is so popular. We're seeing constant conversations about tools and favorite things on Instagram even. You see the potters talking about their tools. But just as an example, these are two handmade crucibles from the same site, Vindolanda. They both, the adaptations to these, or the way they've been produced, they both serve the same purpose, but you see two very, very different ways of doing it. Here we have a bar which is formed across the pouring spout to block the slag, basically. And here you have exactly the same, but it's put into the wall of the vessel. They're serving the same purpose, but it's a preference. And I think that's something else we need to consider. I think there's also potential to consider cross-cultural interactions here, where we're seeing the variety, the huge variety, and we're seeing these massive, like these multicultural societies working in the same fort or in the same area. And I think that's something that I haven't touched on and I'd like to in the future. And I think, as an example, Roman craft economy is pretty well studied. It needs more work, but I think we're actually potentially missing these interactions by focusing on kind of economy, basically, and not looking at these much more personal communications, let's say, between craftspeople. So just to really sum up here, I think the key take-homes, at least, are that some objects or materials fall between specialisms, and I think that despite this, they're really, really worth looking at. I think if we are potentially missing some really important connections here, both for us as archaeologists, but also looking at materials in the past. And this is by, sadly, although, I mean, we have to specialise, there's no arguing that, but I think we need to start opening our eyes and working with much broader kind of ranges of specialists to look at these materials in more detail. And this requires, of course, collaboration and cross-disciplinary work, which is key. And this needs to really be, I think, from the outset in the designing of the projects. The scientific work very much focuses on the Chinook repertoire and the interactions in a very direct manner. And Anne and I were talking about how the different applications of cross-craft interaction is really interesting. And I think with the more scientific side of things, we're really looking at very, very direct interactions here. and that it reveals aspects of the Schiller profile where multi-crafts and interactions played a really important part, or in fact influenced innovation in the shape itself. And then lastly, that recycling of materials really appears to be a very common factor, and this is something that I think also could reveal so much about cross-craft interactions, and something that should be considered in the future. And lastly, just to thank everybody that was involved, all my supervisors, particularly Justine Bailey, who we've been talking about this very subject with very recently, and all the people who have offered me funding, and also the material itself, and to you all for listening. Thank you very much.
What's my turn? Thank you, Carlotta. We learned a lot about Roosevelt. So, now we will come to a discussion about what Carlotta told us. And first of all, are there any questions? No? I mean, okay. Now, looking at these all these developments, I was asking myself, so did they change the design? Did they change the materials, the preferences for materials, because there was a need in the function, or could they apply different functions because there was a development of the crucibles?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's a bit of a difficult one. I think, at least in the Roman period, we see a very different way of using the crucibles. So, as I said, in the pre-Roman period, in Britain at least, and you could tell me about the Aegean, yes. They were applying heat from above. Whereas in the Roman period, you start to see the application of heat from the outside in, and so you're definitely needing the vessels get larger. You know, everything changes, and the materials need to be more refractory, so they need to be more suitable in that way. But whether, you know, I think, demand, it increases massively in the Roman period. We see the huge increase in the amount of metal being used in everyday life. It no longer becomes, it's no longer an elite material, for example. We see it used every day. So I think it had to change, but whether that was because of the materials or I don't know. I don't know if you have an opinion.
We'll discuss about this later. Okay. Vangelio, you have a question.
Carlotta, I want to ask you about, you referred to the crucibles used by metal workers in different locations in the village of the Roman period. How important is the actual type of metal that the crucible was used for? So, metal workers probably there was some specialization, those working silver or gold, I don't know. And is it possible for the same crucible to be used for different types of metals or alloys, or was there any specialization?
There was a beginning of specialization, and you see, I think the metal workers on the forts, the Roman forts, were potentially just kind of generic metal workers, and I think you could use the crucibles were, at least the copper alloys, like this. They could be any shape or size. It didn't really matter. It was about volume and that side of things. There's some suggestion, and I think, Anna, you've published a paper where you saw the relining of the crucible, where you see for reuse, but they were constantly recycling metal. it wasn't a new, so the alloys were constantly changing, and I think it makes it very, very messy to understand actually exactly what they were melting in these. In terms of the precious metals, the gold and the silver, you see much smaller crucibles being used. Whether it was, I think there were probably metal workers who were doing both. I don't think it was a particularly specialised craft, but I think there were exceptions to the rule. There were people who worked as a goldsmith before, and we see in the written sources, we see the beginning of the kind of specialisation of craft people's names, like titles and status and things. And so we see gold workers suddenly becoming an actual profession. And so that's a really interesting kind of development. But I think more generally, in a day-to-day context, you were seeing both copper alloys and gold potentially being melted in the same workshop. It wasn't necessarily, yeah.
We have an online question. Yes, please.
From Anna. Thank you for a very clear presentation. Please tell us, how does it happen that metal is present also outside the vessel itself?
Outside the vessel itself, so on the vessel surfaces, I guess. It was messy. You can watch videos even today and you find metal kind of spills and things falling over the sides of the crucibles. But actually what you see, it can be a bit confusing sometimes. You're basically seeing often a reaction of the metal, of the ceramic itself. So you're seeing what looks like some kind of slag or something forming, but it's often actually just a really vitrified ceramic that's potentially also reacted with the metal. And this is something that was very confusing about these extra layers until kind of the 90s. People were thinking they were slag, but actually they're an extra layer of ceramic that's applied. So it's a messy process, and in the workshops, when you look at them as a whole, which is also something that sadly doesn't happen very often, is you find metal spills everywhere. It's not a clean craft. So yeah.
Okay. Yes, we have two questions here. Who's first? Who's first, please.
Okay. Carlotta, I have a question about your material for Oxfordshire, because there it seems that it was a specific form made for crucibles, as I understood it. You were also mentioning itinerant metallurgists. So for me, this is a little bit of a problem here, because what I understand is these metallurgists, they travel probably with their crucibles, but if they are itinerant, first of all, if they then need to get crucibles made by potters, how and when does that actually happen when they're itinerant? Do they travel with enough crucibles to make sure that they can last until they go back to the place where the potters live, or the potters traveling with them? As if all their crucibles break, because then they have no way of producing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think my interpretation of it, I looked at one of the examples, which was from a villa site in Essex, so in the southeast of England, Guessingthorpe. And there you had examples of one Oxfordshire crucible that was broken, and that was being used to. It was one of the very first. It was the first evidence of a small statue being made in Britain, and the suggestion by everybody who studied it is that it was an itinerant metal worker going to the site to produce this and then probably moving on somewhere else to make the next thing for somebody else. And I think that there was something kind of came to me, it's like, okay, but how did they bring the crucible? But I guess there are many scenarios that could be possible. One of them being that they'd been through Oxford, picked up a crucible, and they were just constantly replenishing their goods as they moved around. So it wasn't necessarily, because there were multiple crucibles, and there was only one of them that was the Oxfordshire. So they potentially had one from Oxford, one that they've made, one. I think that's probably more likely in the situation. And at least that one set of which suggested that it was potentially that they were just collecting as they went along until it broke and replaced it with something that was locally. So
that also basically means that their itinerary was not a huge one. It wasn't to the end, it wasn't in terms of kilometers something that was not feasible to collect new crucibles.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. What about the secondary tools that were used along with the crucible? And by that I mean, this is an industry that is dangerous, and you have human beings interacting with extremely high temperature objects. So there must be, an evolution or development of the tools that are necessary to protect the people who are using the crucible. And do you have any evidence of these tools and their development? Was there anything in the?
We have very little evidence, at least in Britain. We have, when you look at the tools that we do have, it's as if you're looking at a tool set from today. So the Roman period, we have, I think, only one example of crucible tongs that was found in London, and it was identified by a PhD student who was working at the same time as me. And he was able to identify that they were used to obviously collect the crucible from the heat, therefore protecting themselves. And we also find, because these secondary layers that you see on these crucibles, they're so soft that you actually sometimes see imprints from potential tools being used as well. In terms of what else they were using, they could be using many different things that were like leather, for example, to protect themselves, but again, we wouldn't find that necessarily. Although at Vindolanda, we have amazing preservation of organic materials, so potentially one day they might find something like that. But otherwise, we have very, very little information. Other than, actually, sorry, I should say, we have lots of representations of it on artwork. So we have tombs of metal workers, and they have the entire tool set, basically, on them, and vase paintings as well. So we do have evidence that these existed, we just don't have them physically present.
Okay. Thank you for your great talk. It was very fascinating. You shed light in a very complex topic, carrying multi-aspects: social, economic, anthropological, and technological, of course, and cultural. So my question is simple, coming from my topic, which is more in physical metallurgy and materials characterization. And I enjoyed your micrographs. These two side by side, I think, was bright light illumination and cross-polarized light, showing these various microstructures. Did you proceed to show if there are any similarity across the objects that you have examined? And I'm mostly talking about the microstructure and the special constituents, the phases that are in these materials, very beautifully shown. So
we have there's quite a lot of similarity. I mean, it's site by site. It's I looked at one INH site from the south of Britain, which was using these, and actually that's where the photomicrographs you're talking about are from. And they were using very specific materials for the crucibles and very specific materials for the hearth they were like melting in. And so there was definitely a trend in materials, and you see in that period it's kind of a common trend of quartz tempering, but also organic tempering to open up the microstructure of the kind of ceramics to make them porous. In later periods, you see, again, very heavily quartz tempered material. And with the Hessian crucibles, the post-medieval crucibles, you start seeing the development of mullite. And what was, I'd forgotten until I reread the paper today, actually, by Marcos Martino Torres, who looked at these. These crucibles, made in Britain, are they're not identical, of course, but they're of a very, very, very similar ceramic to the ones that produce these Hessian crucibles. But what makes them different, and what makes these Hessian crucibles more desirable, better, is that they are fired to an incredibly high temperature before use, which forms mullite. And therefore, you have a very, very, very strong vessel. Whereas the Stanford ware crucibles, you don't have that pre-firing, that high pre-firing. So you don't have the same formation, and therefore you have a slightly weaker ceramic.
So this is also an evidence of the use of these ceramics as crucibles?
Yes, but for these ones it's difficult. With the unfired examples, they're much lower fired, so we don't have any mullite performing. But with these ones, even the unused, so the ones that were straight from the kiln, with no use in metalworking at all, still already have mullite. So they were pre-firing them to a very high temperature, which was making them a superior material.
Thank you. Okay.
Are there any more questions?
Yes, I have another one. Thank you. Carlotta, with the horizontal spread of specialization, I think you know what's coming. You said that there is that split off of crucible workers out of the potters and the metallurgists, so they become their own profession, let's say. Now, how do they, in those situations and that development over time, accommodate or continue to follow the changes or even innovations in metallurgy?
I think it's something that I've literally just started playing with, so it's a good question, and I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. It's something that I think happens in a much later period in this work that I haven't. This is obviously, I've worked a little bit on these crucibles, but not very much, and I think it would be something definitely to look at to see. I don't know how long we lived this productions and how they change over time. Mark was very much focused on identifying these productions. We didn't understand them completely, so he focused on that. But I think there are aspects of it that would be really interesting to look at across time and to see how that develops. Because obviously metallurgy, even in the post-medieval period, is seeing huge developments, and we're seeing. So I think it would be really interesting to see how that develops. And yeah, it's a good idea.
Because now we have the platforms and the social media to ask for changes and update, but at that time that was not the case.
Exactly. So I think if there were changes, there must have been feedback as well to stay in touch. And I think that's what's interesting today is that it seems. I wonder how much interaction happens today, like how stationary these products are, or how much, do we see any of that happening? I think that would also be interesting, like to take it into the modern day again.
I wonder if it happens to traveling apprentices, or apprentices that travel with some of these people.
Yeah, it's very possible. Yeah.
May I ask another question? Because do you think from these crucibles we could learn something for technologies, for modern technologies? You show this post-medieval crucibles and later these graphite crucibles. Now, speaking about the Roman crucibles, for example, do you think there's any potential for learning something from these for potentially new materials?
I'm not sure if it's necessarily new materials, but I think it's a case that is a really good case for arguing that material scientists should look at archaeological material. Because when we were looking at the two-layered crucibles and looking at the properties in the experiments we were doing, I found all this literature that was looking at multi-layered ceramics and the benefits of it and how wonderful they are. And they take an inspiration from nature, from teeth and shells. And whilst this is, of course, fantastic, and they came to the same discovery, the Romans had discovered this thousands of years ago. And I think actually this is really, there's so much potential to look at these, these things and to...
Or what we say, or what we call this biomimetics, so it's also archaeomimetics.
Exactly, yeah, I agree completely.
Okay. Are there any more questions now? Who wants to?
If there are no further questions, no online either, can I invite you all for a drink upstairs with a little nibble, and help me in thanking both Carlotta and Anna for a great discussion and a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.